So today we're continuing our lecture series on conservative political thought. Today we're welcoming Professor Boyd. He's associate professor of government at Georgetown University. He's also the director of the Tocqueville Forum for Political Understanding. Professor Boyd researches and teaches on intellectual history of liberalism, civil society, pluralism, economic sociological theory, theory and practice of immigration citizenship policy in the United States. And he is the author of Uncivil Society, the Perils of Pluralism and the Making of the Modern Liberalism, published by Alexis. He also the co-editor of Tocqueville and the Frontier of Democracy, and the editor of the recently published Cambridge Companion to Democracy in America, both published by Cambridge University Press. He has published over like 40 articles and book chapters on a variety of thinkers and themes within the intellectual history of liberalism. And today he's going to be talking about like Alexis Tocqueville, his conservative liberalism. So as you see, most of his research was done on like, the history of liberalism. And now we're going to be covering him within like our class on conservative political thought. So dealing with like Alexis Tocqueville and his so-called like liberal conservatism, or as you can call it. Yes, please welcome Professor Boyd.
Thanks for your kind introduction and for having me here. I guess my talk today is going to be loosely based on a chapter in the Cambridge Companion to Democracy in America, the work that was just referenced. And I guess in addition to this chapter, maybe even more so than this chapter, one of your professors has a very excellent chapter in this volume as well. So there's lots of interesting things about democracy in America, the work, and why I think it's a work worth taking seriously even today. So I guess the starting point for my chapter, the talk today, and maybe even for Tocqueville studies in the 21st century, is the number of different and also competing appropriations of Tocqueville. And some of these figures are going to be immediately recognizable, others less so. But it's, I think, noteworthy that Tocqueville and Democracy in America have been cited, not just cited in terms of name dropping, but cited as being influential by figures as different as Karl Rove here, Saul Alinsky, George Bush, Barack Obama. In the academic world, figures as different as Robert Nisbet, someone you may have encountered in this course before as a leading 20th century conservative. Samuel Huntington, in his work on immigration. Robert Putnam is a sort of left of center, left political scientist from Harvard, his work on Baldwin alone. So the ubiquity of Tocqueville and references to Tocqueville, I think is interesting in and of itself. Everybody likes Tocqueville. Everybody can find something in Tocqueville that they agree with. And yet the things that people find seem to be at some level mutually incompatible. Are they really appealing to the same Tocqueville? Are they using and abusing the work? Those are the kinds of questions that have interested me. And so a lot of the recent stuff I've been doing on Tocqueville is about ways in which he's been cited pro and con on different issues. You might think, well, this is something that's new, right? This is just, we in the 21st century are not very comprehensive readers. We like to drop names and throw quotes into our op-eds in the New York Times. But it's actually, I think, not so much a statement about our own ideas as it is about Tocqueville's ideas, because this whole tradition of appropriating Tocqueville toward political positions that would seem to be opposed to one another really goes back to the publication of Democracy in America. So just to mention one instance of this, a particularly interesting instance of this, when the book appeared in French in the original in 1835, volume 1, he was someone who was immediately heralded as a prophet by people on both the right and the left, and especially in England. So here, this figure is someone I think you would encounter in your syllabus so far, John Stuart Mill, like a true liberal, reform-minded man of the left, progressive. He was not only someone who wrote approvingly of Tocqueville, but a real kind of conduit for bringing Tocqueville's ideas into England. And yet, this was sort of ironic in that Tocqueville was also making a splash among Tories and Conservatives in Britain at that moment. This less familiar figure, Sir Robert Peel, Prime Minister, I think a couple times for England, one of the great opponents of the reform movement and liberalization of democracy. And both of these figures are citing Tocqueville. Peel famously cites Tocqueville in a speech about if you want to see what democracy leads to, look at America. Right? Look at the tyranny of the majority, look at the leveling, right? Look at all the terrible pathological things associated with democracy. Look, and who points this out? This young aristocrat Tocqueville. So the book itself was received and reviewed very favorably, not just by Peel, but by many other Tory publications in Britain at that time. But I think in terms of understanding the spirit of the book and understanding Tocqueville's own intentions, I think John Stuart Mill was really the better, more accurate interpreter. And so he, recognizing the way in which this book has made an impression and is being championed by the right, in one of his very famous review essays upon the appearance of Volume 2 of Democracy in America, he acknowledges this fact that some of Tocqueville's phrases are susceptible of a Tory application, right? Acknowledging that people are citing this book for, I guess I would say, at cross purposes. So I think Mill is right about this. Some of Tocqueville's phrases, like, for example, tyranny of the majority, are indeed susceptible of the Tory application. But part of this that I think Mill misses is that it's more than just a few phrases. That is to say, there are fundamental arguments woven into democracy in America that I think are characteristic of a certain version of conservatism. And it's those aspects of democracy in America that I want to try to focus in on today in the talk. So one of the ways in which scholars have tried to deal with the ambiguities of Tocqueville, the fact that he's someone who's so easily appropriated by both the right and the left, is to characterize his political thought in terms of a strange liberalism, right? And I guess the starting point for my talk is really the taxonomical question of what do we call Tocqueville? How do we translate Tocqueville's strange version of liberalism into recognizable contemporary political labels? We today speak in terms of left and right, but Tocqueville in Democracy in America, and I think throughout his thinking, works in terms of democracy and aristocracy. So is it possible to translate his terminology, his conceptual apparatus, into terms that make sense in contemporary politics? In one sense, the question of what was Tocqueville? Was he a liberal? Was he a conservative? Was he something else? In one sense, this is actually a very easy question. One looks at his biography. He was unequivocally, in his own time, a political liberal. I think this is something that's very often misunderstood or really almost kind of actively undermined among people who both like Tocqueville, but also many people who are critical of Tocqueville. He's often confounded as a kind of nostalgic aristocrat. And indeed, he was an aristocrat and he was nostalgic. But I think he's somebody who's interesting insofar as he was able to separate his own political activities, his own view of the future of democracy, from the fact that he recognized that something was being lost as we move beyond this forgotten world of aristocracy. So even though scholars, most Tocqueville scholars who are historically oriented, have correctly labeled him as a political liberal, right? Someone who was of the left, who, when he was elected to the Chamber of Deputies, they have to decide what side of the aisle you're going to sit on. Right? And this was, I guess, a big struggle for him to figure out where he wanted to place himself. And he ultimately chose to sit on the left side of the aisle, albeit in the center left, not on the far left, nor maybe in the place people would have expected him to sit on the right, along with many of his aristocratic peers, other members of his family who were much more sympathetic to trying to halt democracy and to restore in some way aristocracy and monarchy and the other things that have been swept away by the French Revolution. So the fact that people have appealed to him as a liberal and yet have, and the terms here in quotes are terms that scholars have used to qualify what kind of liberal he was. According to Alan Cahan, he was an aristocratic liberal, right? The kind of liberal, the species of liberal he was a liberalism that was somehow alloyed with an aristocratic sensibility. An elitist liberal, right? An elitist liberal, perhaps in the same way that John Stuart Mill was an elitist liberal, somebody who believed in liberty but was ambivalent about democracy. a strange liberal in the sense that there were many key components of his thought that didn't fit easily into liberalism and seemed maybe even anti-liberal, if not illiberal. And then the other appellation, this I think is the term coined by Russell Kirk, a conservative liberal or a liberal conservative. That is, the thing that is alloyed with his version of liberalism is this conservative sensibility. So again, I think the fact that his political theory is in fact liberal, it's part of the genus of liberalism, and yet his species is qualified and has been qualified by so many scholars in this way, speaks to the uniqueness of his particular species of liberalism. But maybe, and this will be the point of my talk in just a second, these qualifications also tell us something about his conservatism. That is, I think, different dimensions of what all of these interpreters of Tocqueville are trying to get at is that there is, in fact, something genuinely conservative. That those aspects of democracy in America are not merely a few phrases that can be twisted around or exaggerated, but they're really the framework of democracy in America. And as we'll see at the end of my talk, also, I think this carries over even more so into the Ancien regime, really is stamped by certain generic characteristics of conservatism. So conservatism, as you know from this course, if nothing else, is something that means a number of different things, different variations of conservatism, some of which I guess you could say the United States, the conservative tradition in America is a tradition that tries to be, at least in some of its permutations, consistent with liberalism, conservative liberalism. There are other species of conservatism in the world or in America that seem not to be interested in somehow combining themselves with liberty, but to be anti-liberal in some ways. But nonetheless, this broad trunk of conservative thought seems to draw upon certain key characteristics. Here, I wouldn't necessarily draw the trunk of the tree and the roots of the tree the same way as in this illustration, but I think it does capture the point that there are certain basic assumptions, right, fundamental values that most conservative thinkers would acknowledge and advocate. The 6 of them that I want to spend some time talking about and tracing to Tocqueville are first the preponderance of tradition, the idea that origins matter and that history matters. And it's very, very difficult, if not impossible, for peoples to overcome the conditions that gave rise to institutions, to governments, to habits, to mores, to customs. Secondly, and this is maybe the thing that's most closely associated with Tocqueville, the idea of civil society, right? The importance of local institutions in performing a number of tasks, providing certain public or collective goods. Thirdly, not all conservatives and not all versions of conservatism, but many conservatives, I think maybe even the paradigmatic throne and altar conservatives, Joseph de Maistre or Bonal or others, believe in the centrality of religion, right? If not an established religion, throne and altar, but at least some public role for religion. And conversely, they lament the secularization they associate with progressivism or other political ideologies that they condemn. Fourthly, equality, right? The perils of equality. Not necessarily that equality is not a value or that equality is not something, as Tocqueville acknowledged, that is a part of the future that's unfolding in the world, but that this equality can't be, from the vantage of conservatism, simply taken as an absolute value, right? That there are certain problems that emerge with equality taken to extremes. And I'll say some more about that and the examples of that in Tocqueville. The ambivalence to free markets. I think this is another one that may seem a little bit surprising to us. We tend to associate the political right with a political position that is in favor of free markets, right? We think free trade, right? Free markets, capitalism. That's a position that most often in the United States falls on the right side of the political spectrum. But in terms of Tocqueville's conservatism, one of the things that I think is striking about people on the right who try to appropriate Tocqueville is that Tocqueville, while not being a socialist by any means, he's someone who's deeply ambivalent about free markets. And he recognizes that while markets may bring prosperity, prosperity has perhaps a darker underside of its very own. Say a little bit about that. And then lastly, the critique of not so much the state, but the administrative state. It's not like a big state versus a small state, but a certain conception of what it is that the state is doing and the effects of the actions of the state on the moral character and the independence and the local liberties of individuals. So I think these are all attributes that I hope you maybe recognize from other thinkers that you've dealt with in this class, or just in terms of people we think of today in America as being political conservatives. And I want to try to show how all of these are, I think, fundamental dimensions of Tocqueville's thought. Okay, so tradition. Here, of course, maybe you may or may not recognize this scene or the painting, but this is one of the famous paintings that illustrate the Mayflower Compact, or the signing of the Mayflower Compact on board the Mayflower off Plymouth Harbor here. I could get into who all these different figures are and what the significance is of the ones who are wearing the collars and the ones who are wearing the workman's clothes. But the main point of this is that for Tocqueville, America's founding is fundamentally a Puritan founding. That is, the story that he tells in Democracy in America is a little bit different, I think, than the story that most people tell of America today. If you asked an average American today, what's America's birthday? What's the origin, the point of origin of America? You would most likely hear 4th of July, right? July 4, 1776. When people teach classes on American political thought, they very often refer to the Declaration of Independence as being the point of origin, the birthing moment of the United States. For Tocqueville, interestingly, the Declaration of Independence, unless I'm mistaken, is nowhere cited in Democracy in America. He mentions Jefferson, and I believe he cites from Jefferson's Fields in the state of Virginia, but there's no mention of the Declaration of Independence. And when he's referring to this point of origin, instead he cites at length from the Mayflower Compact, as if somehow the real true character of America, the real true moment of our formation, was there in the early 17th century, rather than, as we tend to think today, in the late 18th century. In his view, it was all there already at the time of the arrival of the Puritans. Well, we can quibble with his historiography and we can quibble with his sociology, but the point I think that we'll have to take away from this is that Tocqueville here is expressing a traditional mainstay of conservatism, and that's the idea of path dependency, right? That origins really do matter. And I think those are some of the most interesting chapters in Democracy in America. The chapter that begins with the point of origins and how he talks about the metaphor of the child in the cradle and everything is there at the beginning. The implication of this, and even of the way he describes early America as the Anglo-Americans, the suggestion is that most of what it is that we think of as being distinctive about America is not something that we created for ourselves, right? The Enlightenment ideas of a bunch of brilliant people conceiving a new regime based on reason and reason alone. Tocqueville's argument is that most of the things in America that allow democracy to work well are things that the Puritans and the Anglo-Americans brought with them. Right? They brought with them, just to mention a few, they brought with them the idea of municipal government, township government, doing things at a local level. They brought with them a public education and a value enlightenment. They brought with them a particular congregationalist dissenting version of Protestantism. They brought with them other things like local liberties and the habit of making good use of liberty. So the point of at least the volume 1 of Democracy in America seems to be that while we today focus in on legislation, right, people writing laws and nations being able to change their direction and reform their institutions, the real takeaway for volume 1 seems to be the preponderance of what he calls circumstances and mores over and above laws. Right? Again, not that laws don't matter, or not that it's somehow beyond the power of human beings to recreate governments or to write new things and change directions, but it's very difficult. And laws very often run up against the challenge of a lack of auspicious circumstances or mores that are not supportive of whatever legislation you might imagine. Finally, the very way in which he understands liberty is, I think, interesting and maybe also connected up with this idea of tradition. We tend to think, I guess we, I keep saying we, the royal we here, we, those of us who identify with and are interested in the tradition of classical liberalism, most often think about liberty understood as the absence of restraint. Right? I have liberty if nobody's keeping me from doing what I want to do, and conversely, I lack liberty if somebody is preventing me, right, from doing what I choose. But for Tocqueville, liberty is something that is deeply tied up with practices. Liberty is something we learn to do. It's like riding a bicycle or learning how to cook or do plumbing, some other art. It's a habit, a practice. It's something that's based on experience and actually doing rather than some kind of abstract idea or an artifact of political institutions. And a consequence of this for Tocqueville is that for him, it seems very, very difficult, if not impossible, to take liberty in one place where it's flourished, like, for example, the United States, and simply pick it up and transmit it to France, his own nation, to other nations around the world that do not have the same auspicious circumstances or mores that are supportive of political liberty. And so, again, for him, I think tradition matters, and tradition is woven into the argument in Democracy in America in a way that is distinctively conservative. Second point, and again, I think this is one of the arguments most closely associated with Tocqueville, an argument that is not original to him, but certainly the argument that he's often credited with, the emphasis on civil society. For Tocqueville, when he observes America, among the most distinctive things about America is our habit of voluntary association. Coming from France, where all administration is centralized, where it was assumed that government would take on the task of providing all collective goods and micromanaging every single little detail in society, he comes to America and is struck by the number of things that Americans are able to do for themselves voluntarily. This ranges from relatively banal things like there's a big storm in your neighborhood and a tree falls across the road, and what do you know, rather than picking up the phone and calling Washington, D.C. and asking them to authorize you to move the tree off your road, you and your neighbors just grab a couple chainsaws or whatever and go out there and you're done with it in a couple of hours. It ranges from that kind of natural instinct toward association, provide collective goods, all the way to more formal associations like the one that's depicted here. Tocqueville was visiting America right around the time that the temperance movement was starting. I believe this lithograph here is not of the later and better known Women's Christian Temperance Union, but the earlier, I think it's the American Temperance Society. And this was this organization, this movement, were a real seedbeds for political organization. Women who were otherwise prohibited from going into the public sphere and engaging in political activities were nonetheless regarded as being able to and being appropriate for them to spearhead this social movement against alcoholism in America. And as we know in American history, this movement, the temperance movement, eventually grew into movements on behalf of women's rights and women's suffrage, abolitionism, many other prominent social movements in America, political movements emerged out of this spirit of voluntary association. And again, Tocqueville was here in America at the moment, just at the moment when these kinds of associations are taking shape. He even marvels over it. Like in France, if we thought that alcoholism was a problem, we would clamor for the government to do something about it. In America, isn't it amazing that over 1 million people will come together and sign a pledge not to drink, to do everything they can to discourage other people from drinking? He marvels over this, that this could be something that could emerge from the bottom up rather than necessarily being driven by the top down. And then lastly, I guess, we tend today, many people who want to claim Tocqueville as their inspiration, want to make the argument somehow that local communities or voluntary associations will do a better job, right, are more efficient, are a cost-effective way of providing public goods. And I think it's an interesting question whether Tocqueville would agree with that or not. Right? Let's sort of indulge the thought experiment. It seems to me that for Tocqueville, his argument really is that even if families or local communities or voluntary associations don't do as good a job, don't do quite as good a job as the government might do in, say, combating poverty or helping out with communities, that even if local communities don't do as well as the government do, there's still important other reasons why local communities and individuals ought to take upon themselves these tasks, right? And this is, I think, very consistent with the Catholic tradition of what's known as subsidiarity, right? That, how would I say this? That public goods or other kinds of provisions ought to be made by the smallest unit possible, even if, again, that unit doesn't quite do as good a job as raising up that particular thing to the next highest level, to the larger level. Thirdly, religion. You can't read Democracy in America without being impressed by Tocqueville's argument in favor of religion, the necessity of public religion. For Tocqueville, he says, if you want to be free, you must believe in some sense that the spirit of religion and the spirit of political liberty, which in France and in Europe have been at odds with one another, Tocqueville sees in America a place where, at least most of the time, the spirit of liberty and the spirit of politics seem to work hand in hand. Right? People can be free in the political sphere precisely because they obey and submit to authority in the religious sphere. He also, in addition to thinking that a religion in America works well, he also acknowledges that religion in America is a big part of American society. He's struck by the fact that Americans are so religious, especially given the fact that in America there is no established church. Right? The European argument in favor of having an established official church is always that if you don't provide some public support for religion, if you don't have a church that is subsidized or is somehow a part of the state, that religion will dwindle away. People simply lose interest in it if it isn't something that has some official authority or official sanction. Tocqueville says, no, it's just the opposite of that. That in America, religion has an extraordinary vitality precisely because it remains at least institutionally separate from government. So when government does something that people don't like, they don't blame the church, or I guess vice versa. Here, what's being portrayed, of course, is the Second Great Awakening, also going on in the backdrop of Democracy in America when he's visiting. He's touring upstate New York right around the time that other revivalist ministers are going around. People like Jonathan Edwards, I believe, would have been earlier on. Was the other? Yeah, that would have been the earlier historically. But these kinds of movements based on Jonathan Edwards and the Jeremiah and the Great Sermon, these are popping up all over. And the importance of this is that it serves to perpetually revitalize religion. Revitalize religion for Tocqueville because religion has a public function, even if he's quite clear that religion in America does well because it's something based on private belief. And again, I think I mentioned this in the two previous points before, but I think this has some bearing on his concept of liberty. Liberty for him is, again, not simply the absence of restraint, it's moral freedom. That is, a freedom to do those things which are righteous, and only those things which are righteous. And in order for people to be trusted with their liberty, you have to trust that they're not going to abuse it, but they will, in fact, temper it with self-restraint. And at least in Tocqueville's rendition of all this, where does that tempering come from? Where does that self-restraint come from? Where does that sense of moderation come from? In his view, at least, that comes from living in a particular moral or religious tradition. Parallels of equality. What is this? What's going on here? Oh my goodness. This is an illustration of the French Revolution. Here we have the first estate, the aristocracy, the second estate, the clergy, and they're horrified by the third estate, which has been kept down and is here in the process of breaking these chains and taking up arms in the name of asserting its dignity and social mobility and claim its place in political life. Gasp, horror, shock, right? The working classes, right? The lower orders of society are now rising up. Who could be against social mobility? Tocqueville, in point of fact, is not against social mobility. So he's very different than many of his aristocratic peers who, like the people being illustrated here, are horrified, afraid, terrified by his newfound social mobility, this new growth of equality. For him, this is what he takes away more than any other thing, the single governing idea of democracy in America. As he says, among the many novelties that caught my attention during my visit to America, none struck me more vividly. I think in French it's even frappé mes regards, like struck me in the face, punched me up the side of the head, right? Struck me more vividly than the equality of conditions, right? He acknowledges, again, unlike many aristocratic critics, reactionaries who thought that you could somehow roll the clock back on democracy, he acknowledges at the very beginning of the book that this is almost a providential fact. It is inevitable that this wave of democracy, this new spirit of equality is going to spread throughout the world. But Tocqueville thinks that it doesn't follow from that all of the consequences of this are necessarily salutary. We tend to think about equality in the contemporary sense, in the positive sense, as being uplifting. right? That is, what you get in a society where there is this capacity for equality is the opportunity for people to rise up. Right? Like my friend here from the Third Estate, he's about to stand up and proclaim an equal dignity with the other two people looking over him, his social superiors in French aristocratic society. We tend to think about it as an uplifting, right? Equality means that the people on the bottom can rise up to the middle or the top. But Tocqueville, like many of his aristocratic peers, is aware that another possibility of equality is not bringing the bottom up, but it may also and simultaneously entail bringing the top down. There's a kind of middling, or as he says, leveling quality to democracy. And so this is something that has a certain set of costs associated with it, something ambivalent about this, especially if this process is moving too far. Another aspect of equality, a connotation of the word equality, is not just equal in the sense of being of equal status or equal dignity, but equal in the sense of being the same. There's a certain kind of monotony, homogeneity associated with equality. Sameness comes over society. And this is a big part of the critique that he makes, that John Stuart Mill following after him makes, about the vapid, somewhat mediocre, somewhat stultifying character of democratic society. This is also, and not coincidentally, connected to his arguments about the political dangers of the omnipotence of the majority. Right? Once equality becomes the only word, the absolute value, and in which every person's opinion is reckoned to be equal to any other person's, then it follows from that, logically and necessarily, that the right answer must be on the side of the majority. The numerical majority in society. And he worries about people who are in the minority, who may have dissenting opinions, especially if those dissenting opinions are based on some superior knowledge, right? That they're simply outvoted by the tyranny of the majority. And then his argument about individualism, the worry that people are going to be caught back and trapped in the solitude of their own soul, that they're going to drop out of public life and become focused only on themselves. He also attaches this to a certain kind of psychological consequence of democracy. Markets. I mentioned this before. We tend to think about free markets as being a traditional right-wing, rather conservative position. Tocqueville's position on this, again, is a nuanced position. It's also an ambivalent position. What's portrayed here is Manchester, right? The mills, the new industrial city of Manchester in England. This makes a big impact on Tocqueville. He visits England. His wife is English. He visits England. I think it's the 1835 visit that he makes to like the book tour for democracy in America. The book comes out, and I better go over to England to promote the book. A big deal over there now. They're talking about me in Parliament, so I better turn up. So he goes over to England and he tours around. And among the places he visits are these new industrial cities, Manchester, Birmingham, and he's shocked by them. I won't read the entire quote here, but you get his very, very literary portrayal of what these cities looked like at the time. And there's a kind of aesthetic and moral revulsion to what industrialization and capitalism are bringing to the world. Again, there's some sense of the inequity of this. There's some sense that rather than the sweeping away of inequality, one of the possibilities that he foresees for democracy is the invention of a new industrial aristocracy, right? People who are now superior based on wealth and wealth alone, and people who have no corresponding sense of social duties or obligations. This, for him, is almost an inevitable consequence of a capitalist society. And then more broadly, this is something you see in the Ancien Regime, the readings from the Ancien Regime that you took a look at today, a certain kind of contempt, a certain kind of critique of bourgeois society, especially a society based on making money, that sees the making of money and the accumulation of material wealth as being the be-all and end-all, and that as being something that comes at the expense of a sense of civic engagement and civic duty. That's a big theme in democracy in America. I think it's in many ways, even bigger theme in the Ancien Regime. And then I guess in terms of other consequences of this, the administrative state and soft despotism. Some of the most haunting imagery, some of the most, I think, resounding arguments in all of democracy in America come in the second to the last or the third to the last chapters at the very end on what kind of despotism democratic peoples have most to fear. And there, Tocqueville talks about the problem of democratic despotism. The despotism of old was easy, right? The despotism of old was Napoleon Bonaparte, Hitler, right? Grand Mal tyranny. one strong person, an authoritarian figure who exercised tyranny over everyone else. The kind of despotism that he associates with modern democracy is of a new form. It's what he calls a soft, democratic despotism. It's a despotism that's exercised by the administrative state, acting in a way that's benevolent, that's well-intentioned, that really does try to provide goods for people, but ultimately ends up being infantilizing. The metaphor that he has for this is that administrators are essentially like school marms or school mistresses, and the citizens end up just being like children, right? Ultimately passive, right? Irresponsible, happy to relinquish their freedom and their choices to someone else. And the worry, again, consistent with the previous worry about capitalism, that in a democracy, citizens may care more about being prosperous rather than being free. They might happily hand over their liberty, provided that some government will maintain their well-being. Okay, so if we take those to be first characteristics, generic characteristics of conservatism, and second, to be, if I'm right about this, main themes in democracy in America, the question would be, how does the ancien regime follow up on these particular themes? Or I guess my allegation, my claim, a claim that is bold but also unsupported, less supported, is that in many ways, right, the ancien regime is the culmination of Tocqueville's conservatism. It's a much more explicitly and much more consistently conservative work than was democracy in America. A number of reasons you could even propose for why that's the case. Tocqueville, in between the publication of this volume 2 and then his retirement from political life and his composition of the ancien regime, a lot of stuff happens. A lot of stuff happens in France, and a lot of stuff happens to him. I think the two most significant that lead to this increasing conservatism are the Revolution of 1848. The so-called June days, right, where Paris was overrun by angry, violent mobs, and many other people like Tocqueville feared for their lives. These uprisings were violently put down by the armies, and that you can read, and you read his recollections, his memoirs of those days. There's terror on the part of Tocqueville. He's thinking back to how his own ancestors lost their heads in the guillotine, right? And he's seeing this same dynamic playing out in front of him in Paris in 1848. The other event is that after this, and then the eventual formation of the Second Republic, Tocqueville enlists in this project of trying to write a new constitution, but the Second Republic is really not really doesn't even take effect until Napoleon III, stages his coup d'etat, and declares himself eventually within a year or so as the second emperor. So at that point, Tocqueville gives up on political life. He's old, he's not chronologically old, he's older, he's sick, he realizes that he has serious health problems. And at this point, he thinks that there really is very little he can do for political life. And he then retires to the south of France, where he has access to some interesting archives. He does a lot of research, and he composes a work that was supposed to be about the French Revolution. And yet, as we discover when you're reading the Ancien Regime, it's really not so much about the French Revolution as what it is that came before the French Revolution. In the argument, we have so many echoes, not even echoes, maybe amplifications of the arguments that I've identified earlier in Democracy in America. The idea of the French Revolution as being a kind of religious revolution, a revolution like no other insofar as it crosses national bounds. It has a certain kind of religious quality to it, notwithstanding the fact that it is hostile, explicitly hostile to the French Catholic Church and organized religion. He points out there, even more explicitly than in Democracy in America, how the breakdown of social bonds, social connections, organic relationships facilitates the rise of despotism. Equality compounds this danger. If despotism is a danger, equality in a number of different ways, psychologically, sociologically, seems to facilitate this dynamic. He mentions that among the problems that France suffered from, even before the revolution, certainly after the revolution, is that the fact that this regime, the society, the ruling passion in that society is for money and material comforts, that's place-seeking and corruption. Other things are things that he complained about throughout his own political career. And then rather than, I think this might even be something where a light bulb went on. In Democracy in America, this problem of soft despotism and of a tutelary administration is something that he puts off on the horizon in the future. What he discovers in his research for the Ancien regime is that rather than being a new phenomenon, this idea of administration and administrators doing everything and planning everything in people's lives to the point where centralization overcomes political liberty, this is actually an 18th century phenomenon. This is something that predated the revolution rather than coming after the revolution. And then finally, I think there's a broader point that is in many ways new both to Tocqueville's work, but also I think new in the history of ideas. Many other theorists have talked about the significance of revolutions, but I think it was Tocqueville's great insight that revolutions under certain circumstances can themselves be conservative, right? The point about the French Revolution, I guess the weak claim that he's making here, as he says, and I'll read this quote at length because I think this captures exactly the conservative insight that runs throughout all of the Ancien regime. The French made in 1789 the greatest effort by any people to sever their history in two parts, so to speak, and to tear open a gulf between their past and future. Right? So never before in human history, and sort of after, sadly, there have been other instances of this after, but never before in human history has a people tried to completely transform itself and completely break with its own past. I've always fancied that they were less successful in this regard than has been believed. That's the understatement of the Ancien regime, right? Because the whole point is that all the things that people blame on the French Revolution were already there before the French Revolution. The French Revolution simply deepened a tendency that was already there in place. So it's not that, as Edmund Burke would say, that revolutions are destructive. Right? For Burke, revolutions end up throwing out the baby with the bathwater. Revolutions indiscriminately sweep everything away, and by clearing everything away, they destroy the foundations. Tocqueville's argument, I think, is slightly different than that. It's that revolutions are not simply destructive, maybe they're more importantly futile. But they not only don't succeed in breaking from the past and sweeping away existing institutions, but they end up actually reinforcing the very institutions that they purported to destroy. It's not that like you can't get that just reading from the Ancien regime, but interesting, the first figure that brought this particular gloss to my attention, and I think in a very bizarre way, one of the best and most perceptive readers of Tocqueville is a figure that no one ever associates with Tocqueville, a figure George Sorel. George Sorel was a radical syndicalist, a kind of Marxist in inspiration, but eventually somebody who broke with orthodox Marxism. He's a Frenchman writing in the first couple of decades of the 20th century, and he wrote a very famous book called Reflections on Violence, where he calls for proletariat revolution. And so you think a guy like this, a radical anarchist on the left, a Marxist, why would he be reading Tocqueville? Why would he like Tocqueville? Why would he say all this? Among the most cited figures in Reflections on Violence is Tocqueville, the Tocqueville of the Ancien regime. And the reason why Sorel is so impressed by Tocqueville is precisely because Tocqueville understood how revolutions could have this conservative dimension. As he says, Tocqueville's researches allow us to study the French Revolution from this point of view, that is, from the point of view of the principle of conservation. He stunned his contemporaries when half a century ago, he showed them that the revolution had been a lot more conservative than anyone had supposed until then. It follows from all of this, Tocqueville studied the Ancien regime, the enormous role the principle of conservation plays throughout even the greatest of all revolutions. So I think that's a part of Tocqueville's argument here. What does the revolution do? What does it lead to? It's merely a reassembling of, or the continuity of, or even deepening of tendencies that were there before the French Revolution came along. So to conclude then, I think Tocqueville is a figure who is a believer like Edmund Burke in reform, right? Somebody who, after all, dedicated the majority of his life to engagement in French politics, serving in the Chamber of Deputies, serving as a foreign minister, here he's depicted alongside his friend Beaumont and others, trying to come up with a draft of a new constitution of the Second Republic. He's somebody who believed that there was some room for political life, and yet, given his growing pessimism, we tend to forget about his commitment to liberty, his sense of moderation, and his emphasis on the centrality of the political. I think all those are things that come through maybe more strongly in the Tocqueville regime. These are, to switch things back away from the conservatism and back to the liberalism, that's maybe the more recognizable part of Tocqueville's arguments. These are, interestingly, the very aspects of Tocqueville's liberal political theory that allowed him to be rediscovered by people like Raymond Aron, Francois Fourier, and others in the 20th century, and that then allowed him to be rehabilitated and used as a weapon against Marxism, against fascist totalitarianism by figures like Russell Kirk and other Robert Nisbet and others in the 20th century. So that's all I have. Thank you very much, and look forward to questions about this and then discussing the ancien regime with students in the class later. Thanks. So Professor Abramico, professors, how shall I discuss questions?
You can moderate, if you want. Throw the floor.
Questions, objections? Yes, gentleman down there.
So I've written down, is equality a good thing? And then my obvious follow-on to that is, just because I'm smarter, should my opinion be valued more? If we're talking about something scientific, what would Tocqueville say about that?
Yeah, so is equality a good thing? I think Tocqueville would say that it is, in many respects, a good thing. I think he would say whether it's a good thing or a bad thing, it is the wave of the future, right? So the notion of the true conservatives, right, the reactionaries, if I could use that distinction, reactionary versus conservative, the idea of the reactionary is that you can somehow put the genie back in the bottle, that you can somehow maintain or maybe even rebuild these inequalities that society was predicated on. That's not an option anymore. So the question is, how do you work with a world where we're moving toward equality without allowing equality to somehow swamp or overshadow distinctions of wisdom, distinctions of expertise, distinctions of virtue? That's a problem for him. So to get back to your more concrete question, I guess Tocqueville would say that one of the problems or one of the limits of democracy is the scenario that you envision. Imagine that there is some very, very, very specialized question that we need to decide. And everybody in this room, or most people in this room, feel really strongly about one side of that issue, even though they don't really have any firsthand knowledge. It's just something that's important to them. They value it a lot. They care about this particular issue. And there's some other people who maybe care as much about the issue, but know more and think differently than what the majority of people do. The problem with democracy, and I think this is a generic problem, Tocqueville didn't recognize this problem. Aristotle sees the same problem. Many thinkers see the same problem. The problem is, in a system of pure democracy where you go by majority rule, you're going to end up with a less informed opinion and a less informed policy insofar as the views of the majority tend to be, or can be under certain circumstances, less reliable or less viable than the views of an educated minority. And so, again, is that in and of itself a damning criticism of democracy? No. What Tocqueville says is that you need to educate democracy. You maybe need to make sure that the average modal opinion is of a higher degree of knowledge and expertise, right? You can bring up the average. You maybe also need to find some way of representing or amplifying the views of the minority, the views of expertise, or the views of every class in society. So I think it is a problem. It's again, not unique to Tocqueville. This is sort of the same argument that John Stuart Mill, the same problem that John Stuart Mill struggles with. His weird way of getting, I don't know if you did this particular stuff from Mill, but Mill's way of getting at this is kind of interesting. You need to kind of, in society, put a finger on the scale of the minority, whatever the crazy view is held out at the extremes. You need to protect that view and maybe even do something to make sure there's always a devil's advocate on every issue. And then in terms of the mechanical question that you asked, for Mill, the answer is the people who know more, their vote should count. Everybody should get to vote, right? This weird scheme he has for weighted voting, proportional representation. The idea would be that everybody gets at least one vote because it's important for him, for human dignity, and to learn gain political experience, that everybody be able to participate in the democratic process. But you somehow weight votes in such a way that the views of the, in his view, elite educated minority are not simply overshadowed by the views of the masses. again, to be very clear, this is Mill's argument, not Tocqueville's argument, and certainly not my argument. But the critical side of the argument that they're making, I think is worth taking seriously. It does seem to be a generic problem with any democratic system. 51% is 51% plus is always going to decide what's best for the other 49%. And what if it's not always the case epistemically that the 51% knows better than the 49% or the 10% or the 2%? It seems to be an epistemic and institutional problem. Yes, John, in the back.
You talked a little bit about way Tocqueville talks about communities, especially like religious communities, and that's something that is, I think, talked about a lot more. You mentioned Bowling for Soup or like Hillbilly Elegy, books like that kind of discussion. What do you think Tocqueville would make of the state of those communities in the US now and the discussion around them?
I mean, I think in general, I'll stick with how do I say this? The main contribution of Tocqueville, right? That if you have a society where there is no civil society and where there is no integrity to local communities, I think Tocqueville would say that you have problems. That there are things that local communities can do, things that local communities need to do, if only for themselves, and not necessarily because they do a better job of it than would the government, the state. So the problem would be then two things, I guess. There are two issues really that could follow from that. One would be, what do you do if the local communities that you have lost that capacity? What if you're in the situation of France in the 19th century, where he says, it's weird in France. I look back at all these old records from the 15th, 16th, 17th centuries, and I see there that their system and their institutions looked a lot like America's, and yet they're in some way ossified, right? It's almost as if they're no longer a living organism. They're still there, they just don't do anything anymore. And under those circumstances, he really is kind of at a loss as to what France can do given this path dependency, given that these local communities have atrophied to something. So I think there's a real problem in that civil society is something that you have to kind of be lucky enough to have. And then if for whatever reason you squander it or you allow it to be destroyed, there is no sort of magic wand that you can wave to somehow make these communities come back to life. You can stop doing the bad things that you were doing that have destroyed the communities, but it doesn't follow from that they will simply spontaneously reorganize themselves. If only, right? It would be so easy. Then the other part of it that may or may not be related to this, but I read that book a long time ago, and I kind of struggle with Vance's attitude toward those communities, that on the one hand, he sees the resources of extended families and local communities and people who have maintained their connections to small towns and their roots. But if I recall, he also acknowledges that maybe there's something sometimes not so good about that there's maybe a certain dysfunction that's transmitted in the communities. That I recall in his household and his neighborhood and other things, and talking about how there's ways in which those communities are not helpful, actually. And I think that's an aspect of Tocqueville's argument that hasn't been fully reckoned with among his interpreters. People who want to make him into this apostle of civil society assume that he thinks, and that actually civil society has always been good. Whereas if you look at what he says, sometimes civil society can be claustrophobic, civil society can be illiberal. There's all kinds of uncivil examples. First, reverting to earlier research and earlier arguments, but there's lots of things that are for him very problematic about local communities. So it's not just a given, local communities and civil society are like a silver bullet that will cure every problem. I think he recognizes, as anyone would have to, that there's something ambivalent about it. So they can be a resource, but they can also be, in some ways, a barrier or a hurdle. Yeah. I hope I'm not misremembering or mischaracterizing that book. I remember reading it and really being impressed by it at the time. Is that right? He's sort of ambivalent,
yeah.
nostalgic, and yet, there are also some problems here. Let's see, who else? Was your hand up?
Yes. Does Tocqueville ever see the irony of criticizing the aristocracy while he was part of it himself? Does he ever write about that or mention it?
Criticizing the aristocracy. I think he would want to say that his argument is not a criticism of aristocracy so much as an acknowledgement that aristocracy has had its day. right? That, and I guess in his defense, he does acknowledge that there's some good things, right, that come with the passing of aristocracy. Aristocracy was at its worst characterized by injustices and by abuses and by irresponsibility, certain kind of neglect of what was truly best for the public good as opposed to the good of a particular aristocratic family or class. So he recognizes, there's a passage near the end of volume 1 where he says, let's step back and talk about the balance sheet, I think is the term that he sometimes gets translated as the balance sheet. Let's add up all the pluses of aristocracy and factor in, of course, the minuses of aristocracy, of which he acknowledges several. And then let's put on the other side of the equation all the pluses, the considerable pluses he allows for democracy. And then, of course, the dangers of democracy that he's very well aware of. And I think he acknowledges that on the whole, we're probably better off having moved to a world of democracy. But it doesn't follow from the fact that the new sum is greater than the older sum, that there have been some really, really, really important things that have been lost along the way. Some things that it's going to be very difficult to recreate on democratic grounds that aristocracy provided. A sense of the long term, sense of honor, a sense of the importance of things that go beyond the merely material aspects of our lives. These are all things that he associates, rightly or wrongly, with the aristocratic age. And he says that you're going to be hard pressed to try to come to some similitude of those in a democracy. Just democracy is wired different. So I guess I don't see him as being a hypocrite in that way. I do see him as there was always a certain distance between him and the rest of his family, because most of the rest of his family were reactionaries, right? People who never came to grips with the fact that democracy is the way of the future. Tocqueville was the progressive in the family, right? The one who, guys, get with it, right? We're here, let's make our peace with this democracy thing. Let's do the best job we can with the democratic foundations. Many of his, for characterological reasons, maybe reasons of their age, of their own experience, of their own political affiliations, a lot of the rest of his family always felt a little bit uneasy about him. About the fact that he was sort of throwing the aristocracy under the bus. Yeah, so does that help?
Yeah, it does.
I would not characterize his position as being a position of hypocrisy so much as one of nuance and a willingness to acknowledge the strengths and benefits of both systems. Yes, over here.
So it seems to be, Tocqueville seems to be pretty big on the American Revolution. And I'd say that like almost all readings of his, basically all readings of his work would say that he acknowledges that the French Revolution wasn't perfect. And so I guess the question is, where did the American Revolution succeed and the French Revolution fail in his eyes?
Yeah, you're right. I mean, he does, of course, acknowledge the significance of the American Revolution. But it's funny how the way that democracy in America is framed, the American Revolution doesn't play the same kind of central historical role as the French Revolution does. And maybe that's because he just takes for granted what you just said, that the American Revolution succeeded in a way that the French Revolution failed. But it's almost like in democracy in America, he's like being a social scientist, right? What is the or are the independent variables that explain why the American Revolution yielded a relatively stable government that was consistent with liberty while also being, broadly speaking, democratic? How the Americans make this work when the French failed so abysmally and they thought that they were just copying the Americans, right? You asked who were the people who were leading the French Revolution, people inspired by the Great American Revolution. Tom Paine hops from one revolution to the other back in the Americans are not democratic enough, not revolutionary enough. I'll go over and help the French out, right? And yet the French Revolution went horribly, horribly, horribly wrong. So for Tocqueville, the puzzle of democracy in America is what explains that? Is it just these Americans are smarter than the French? The French, like, they could have done something differently? I think his argument hinges not on the nature of the two revolutions as what it was that those societies possessed, right? The kind of reservoir of local liberty and the particular institutions that the Americans had, that the French just happened to lack. And there's another kind of interesting, let's say, case study or compare contrast in the work. He points out that there are many other revolutions, many democratic revolutions by this time in the Americas, including revolutions in Latin America that more or less had adopted, like a carbon copy, the American Constitution. And his point is that it can't just be the laws. If you have two revolutions in two places, and they both adopt the same constitutional system, and it works in one place, but it doesn't work in any of the other places, the answer to what brings about liberty has to be something other than just constitutions. So again, and I think that's an argument that is consistent with the emphasis we place today on the founding fathers, right, in the American Revolution. It allows for the significance of that, but it also points toward other kind of sociological variables that conservatives are interested in. Right, that are things that are about institutions that we don't have control over. Those circumstances and mores, right, that Tocqueville says at the beginning of democracy in America are really a lot more important than constitutions or the particular cast of characters you have during the revolution. Maybe he's wrong about that. I like to think he's wrong about that. But I think that's also the weight of the argument democracy in America. His sociology, his political sociology. Other question, there was a question about here, yes.
Yeah, thanks. In England, in the 1840s, there was a fairly strong, although it was unsuccessful ultimately, but there was a movement towards disestablishment of the established churches. I'm wondering, did Tocqueville leave any writings or observations on that movement?
Not that I know of, no. He cared very much about his work being known in England. While he didn't ever make England like the point of reference of his works, you can see how kind of maybe for England is a sort of model or hybrid between an aristocratic society that has many of the qualities that he likes in America. So many scholars have argued that really neither the French nor the Americans satisfy all the conditions that Tocqueville has in mind, but somehow the English managed to bring together the best of both worlds. But as far as his detailed commentaries, I mean, of course, he's broadly in favor of suffrage reform, although even in France, he sort of changes his mind and waffles on that issue, right? The big reform movement in England is about suffrage, who gets to vote and how representation takes place. And Tocqueville, so far as I know, doesn't weigh in specifically on those issues in England, even though he's following those debates because the same kind of arguments about who gets to vote are playing out in France. And eventually, first he says, no, we shouldn't have universal suffrage. And then eventually he changes his mind on that particular issue. I don't know that he wrote any, to my knowledge, maybe he did, just aware of so many things going on in so many different parts of the world, but I don't know any writings where he really kind of weighed in on one side or the other of that disestablishment argument. One could infer based on what he says about America that he would be in favor of disestablishment, right? Because it works for the Americans, although maybe it works for the Americans for other reasons than it would presumably work for the English. Yeah, so does that, I guess, I don't know anything. Maybe there's a really short answer to that question. I do not know of anything where he specifically wrote about or reckoned that issue. Yes.
You mentioned in one bullet point, circumstances and mores had a big impact, and I was wondering, given he traveled around the US in very primitive times, did he have any comments about the geography of the country and certain elements, the westward momentum and the confrontation with Indians that